Okay, so welcome back to strategy analysis. We are now going to look at the last part of the video, which consists of the last two tasks within this knowledge area. So let me share my screen and we can get stuck in. Okay, so now let's dive right into part 3 of this 3-part video series. Just to remind you once again, we are looking at the business value spectrum and we're on the potential side. For a bit of an explanation of how this all fits in, please refer to the previous 2 videos. Okay, so now we're going to look at the 3rd and the 4th task in this knowledge area. So task 1 we'll look at is assess risks, and then we'll also look at define change strategy. So let's get started. So with task assess risks, the purpose according to the Babok Guide is to understand the undesirable consequences of internal and external forces on the enterprise during a transition to or once in the future state. So question, why do we even assess risks? We do this to determine possible consequences if risks occur, so that we can understand the impact of those consequences. We want to determine the likelihood of the risk, and then we want to understand the time frame when the risk might occur. So let's now have a look at the elements to understand this particular task in a bit more detail. So the elements we'll look at is unknowns, constraints, assumptions, and dependencies. We'll look at negative impact on value, risk tolerance, and recommendation. So with unknowns, now with this consideration, it's really about accepting that there will be uncertainty in the likelihood of a risk occurring and the impact of the risk when it occurs. So however, it's still possible to estimate these aspects based on expertise and collaboration with stakeholders. So previous experiences of similar situations can also guide this conversation. So it's about, we never really know exactly what the likelihood is of something occurring, and we don't fully understand what the impact could be. So this is really just saying, embrace the fact that we don't have all the information and do your best in collaboration with stakeholders to estimate what this could look like. So with the second element, here we're looking at constraints, assumptions, and dependencies. Now, you should consider whether the constraints, assumptions, or dependencies are risks themselves. Let me use an example to bring this to life. So if your future state is, for example, dependent on another project to be completed, you could raise this dependency as a risk to be managed. So this way you could identify the conditions and consequences of what might occur should that project not be completed at all or not completed on time. Okay, so then what does element 3 look at? So the negative impact on value. So risks are expressed as conditions that increase the likelihood or severity of a negative impact to value. So as a business analyst, you should identify each risk's likelihood and impact in order to determine the level of the risk. So for example, a risk could have a low likelihood of actually occurring, but a high impact on the value if it does occur. Now, example ways that you can quantify risks. So you can use financial terms about if something happens, you might lose so many dollars, or you could lose a lot of time, or potentially if something occurs, you may need to redo something, which is a lot of effort. Now, risk tolerance, element 4. This is basically the level or the amount of uncertainty that a stakeholder or enterprise is willing to take in exchange for potential value. Risk aversion is when people are really against taking on any risk, and they will actually pay more money to avoid certain risks in order to achieve their goals. Neutrality, this is where your stakeholders will accept that there are risks, but they will not want the value of their potential value, at least, to have any negative impact on the initiative if the risks should occur. And whether that's even possible, that is not always possible, but that is basically what they're hoping to get to. And then risk seeking, this is when you have a stakeholder group or an enterprise that is in fact even willing to increase risk if it means they could potentially increase their return or the value of doing something. So those are the three categories. Now if we look at element 5, which is all about the recommendations. So in the context of risks, business analysts work with stakeholders to understand the overall risk level and their tolerance for the risk. And based on all of this work that you would have done, you can then come up with a few categories for recommendations. And the first category is you could recommend that they pursue the benefits of a change regardless of the risk. They could pursue the benefits of a change while investing in reducing the risks. You might recommend that they seek out ways to increase the benefits of a change to outweigh the risk. They could identify ways to manage and optimize opportunities. Or you can recommend that they do not pursue the benefits of a change and therefore not do the change. And that in that way, eliminate any risk. All right, so that was assess risks. Now let's delve into the last task, which is about define change strategy. So the purpose of this particular task is to develop and assess alternative approaches to the change and then select the recommended approach. Now, just before I continue, I just want to re-emphasize the fact that the different tasks within this knowledge area and any other knowledge area is not necessarily a sequential set of steps. Although some tasks need to be performed before you could see results with other tasks, and some tasks might be inputs into other tasks, there are lots of tasks that's being performed either in parallel to other tasks or on an iterative basis. Now, this is very much the same in strategy analysis. We've just discussed assess risks. Now, that could happen all through the initiative, and you could continuously be keeping an eye out for any potential risks, and they get assessed and managed. So don't think of any of these tasks as being consecutive tasks or sequential tasks. Try and understand where they fit in, and try and understand that you can do things in parallel, or perhaps things are not necessarily fully matured. You might start a particular initiative's current state analysis whilst also starting to explore some potential ideas for the future state. And then assess risks could be happening all along the journey. Just keep that in mind with all of your BA work. Okay. Now that I've got that off my chest, let's continue with define change strategy. So the purpose here is to develop and assess alternative approaches to the change and then to select the recommended approach. The first element for us to consider is the solution scope. This is the outcome of a change that allows an enterprise to satisfy a need. The solution scope might be described in different ways, including the use of capabilities, technology, business rules, data, process, functions, anything that is relevant to that particular change. A gap analysis, you would have heard this term before, or you may have performed many gap analyses in your career. But essentially, this identifies the difference between the current state and the future state capabilities. So you would assume that before you can perform a gap analysis, you should have a pretty good idea of the current state as well as what the future state would be. So you could do gap analysis comparing a variety of different aspects or things like process, functions, staff competencies, lines of business, organizational structures. It all depends on what needs to be compared and what is the most important gaps to identify in order to work out what do we need to change in order to get to the future state. It is most likely going to include a combination of these different things. Okay, so now the third element is about enterprise readiness assessment. Here, it's about analyzing the enterprise to assess its capacity to make the change and to sustain the change in the future state. It also includes assessing the ability to realize value from the solution once it is implemented. So the change strategy, this is a high-level plan of key activities and events that will be used to transform the enterprise from the current state to the future state. Alternative options for a change strategy is considered in terms of its feasibility, and preferred change strategy is selected considering factors such as organizational readiness, major costs and investments that might be needed, timelines to make the change, alignment to business objectives, timelines for value realization, and opportunity costs of the change strategy. So keep in mind that all of these different factors will potentially have different priorities. So your change approach or your preferred change strategy that ends up being chosen could be because a certain factor or a certain combination of factors are weighing more in terms of company priority, because they might align much stronger with where the business is going than some of these other factors. Okay, and the fifth element is transition states and release planning. Now, as the business analyst, you've been involved with the current state analysis, the future state definition, you've assessed risks, you've also participated in the gap analysis, and you've got a very good understanding of all the different aspects of the proposed change. This is why you are then in a really good position to help with the planning of the timing of the implementation in order to cause minimal disruption to business activities and to ensure that all parties understand the impact to the organization. And this is why it's so important for you to, when you do your current state analysis and when you do your definition of the future state, to take that holistic view and to make sure that you do touch on all these different elements, or at least be sure and comfortable that there are people within your project that are looking at these different elements and bring all of that together when this particular release planning tasks or element is really being executed. Okay, so that's what the task defined change strategy considers when it's being executed by you as the business analyst. So next time or next slide is all about over to you. This knowledge area as a whole is quite a big one. And from an exam preparation perspective, I would really urge you to go and read the study notes, explore some of the examples, and to think back to your own practical experience and try and identify as many as possible of these elements where you got involved or where you could see how this is actually executed in practice. And then you will also recognize that you would have done some of this work iteratively. Share some of your examples, please, and come and participate in the Facebook group. There's a lot of brilliant minds in the Facebook group, and everybody is really keen to help each other. And I think we should all pull together and make sure that everybody gets their certification this year. It is a big year for all of us, so make the most of the opportunity and learn as much as you possibly can. And I hope that today's video has added to some of your knowledge and preparation for exams. So thank you once again, and I look forward to sharing the next topics with you in the coming weeks.